Thank you for joining us for the Workforce Housing Development Program webinar. We know a lot of you have been eager to receive more information about the program now that it lives with us at Minnesota Housing, and we're excited to be able to provide you more details and answer any questions that you have. My name is Devin Pullman, and I'll be presenting today along with Katie Moore. Katie Moore is the Program Manager for the Workforce Housing Development Program, and I'm a supervisor over a number of programs in the multifamily division here at Minnesota Housing. I'm going to be talking about the program requirements today, including the application threshold and scoring requirements. Once I finish kind of my first set of program material and slides, we're going to pause to go over any of the questions you have before Katie launches into the actual application materials, which she'll cover in her portion of today's presentation. Katie will also walk through the website and then all those kind of narrative-based application materials, as well as any supplemental materials that'll be required to submit a successful application to Minnesota Housing. We'll take time again at the very end of the presentation to answer any final or outstanding questions. So our mission. Some of you are likely already familiar with Minnesota Housing and the work we do. For those of you who aren't, Minnesota Housing provides access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and builds stronger communities across the state. It also supports the development and preservation of primarily affordable housing rental through both financing the long-term and as well as the long-term asset management. This program is unique to Minnesota Housing as it expands our scope and reach into helping to serve communities with primarily market rate driven workforce rental housing needs. In terms of today's presentation outline, this is an overview of what we'll be covering. We will give you some background on the program, highlight new and key features of the program based on the 2017 changes at the legislative session, go over the program requirements, including threshold requirements for applicants, and then we'll do a live demonstration of the application materials on the website. We'll finish up the presentation by again answering any final questions that you have. Before we launch into the primary overview of the Workforce Housing Development Program, we also wanted to share some additional resources that Minnesota Housing offers for market rate development. We offer amortizing first mortgages. If the developer that you're working with hasn't already selected a first mortgage, this might be a great option for you to look at and or consider. We are an approved HUD MAP lender and can provide construction and first mortgage financing through MAP. I've listed the primary contact here, Teresa Larkin. She is in charge of our business development efforts here at Minnesota Housing and would be happy to share more information about the MAP loan and our role in underwriting this particular product, if that would be a useful fit. Typically, this does offer or carry the lowest interest rate in the market for this type of financing. So it might be a good thing to explore if you don't already have your first mortgage secured. We also offer a variety of resources for affordable housing development available through our consolidated RFP. One of the changes we'll be talking about that occurred this past legislative session is that the Workforce Housing Development Program now offers an opportunity to serve mixed income development, which would include a portion of units that are market rate as well as a portion that are affordable. So this might be something that your community may have a need for and may be interested in learning more about. Most of our affordable housing development resources are available through our consolidated RFP. That's kind of a big word, consolidated, which means that we, along with our funding partners, review applications for these types of resources bulleted below through a one-time application process that happens annually. Typically, the RFP is released in mid-April with applications due back by mid-June. And then final award decisions are recommended and made to our board of directors in October. So the types of resources that are typically offered through the consolidated RFP include long-term fixed rate amortizing debt, an allocation of low-income housing tax credits, both 4% as well as the 9% tax credits, and a variety of different deferred loans. We have a number of different sources that can provide deferred loans depending on the type of project being considered in the community. So if you are interested in pursuing technical assistance around affordable housing resources offered through our RFP, Susan Thompson is our lead underwriter, and I've listed her contact information here for you as well. You're also welcome, if you're just exploring the space, to reach out to Katie Moore, our program manager, who can give you some more general background information about the types of resources. And then Susan's probably the best contact kind of once you're formulating a particular project in mind to kind of walk through some of the specific underwriting components. Okay, so moving into the program purpose and background with respect to the Workforce Housing Development Program. The purpose is to expand workforce housing in greater Minnesota communities with proven job growth and demand for workforce rental housing. Grant funds are available to create net new market rate residential rental properties in the area. So this program really is designed to create new workforce rental housing opportunities that are primarily market rate driven, but it does include now an opportunity for a mix of market rate plus affordable units. Minnesota Housing has up to $2 million available for this round of applicants. We expect to fund somewhere between 3 and 5 projects through this RFP. Keep in mind that this program is only available for communities outside of the Twin Cities metropolitan area, and our program guide can provide you more definitions and resources if you're interested in sort of understanding how are we delineating who's eligible to apply. And we'll cover some of that throughout the application and this webinar process today as well. In terms of the history of the Workforce Housing Development Program, it's a relatively new program in the state of Minnesota. It was created by the legislature in 2015. Up until now, it's been administered by the Department of Employment and Economic Development at DEED. And then in 2017, it was moved to Minnesota Housing, I think because Minnesota Housing is typically seen as kind of a leader with respect to housing programs here in the state of Minnesota. So what's new with the program now that it lives here at Minnesota Housing? There are a couple of important legislative changes that were made to the program this past year, and some of those we've outlined on this slide. The first is that the population preference increased from 18,000 or fewer residents to 30,000 or fewer residents. So there is a preference as we move through the scoring of applications that we will receive under the program to serve communities with now 30,000 or fewer residents. Funds, as I have mentioned, can now also be used in mixed income projects. What we mean by mixed income or a mixed income property is a property in which some rental units have rent and income restrictions and some units are rented at market rate. This allows applicants more flexibility for securing other major sources of funding and also just more flexibility to meet a continuum of housing needs that may be present in your communities. However, it's important to note that even though mixed income projects are allowable, the statute still requires a preference for projects that serve the highest share of market rate units. Lastly, recipients can now award funds directly to the project as either grants or deferred loans. Previously, recipients were not allowed to administer the funds in the form of a deferred loan. There may be a variety of reasons why a community would choose to award the funds as a deferred loan as opposed to a grant. One would be the ability to recycle dollars back for potentially future housing resources in the community. And there could be other reasons as well. So that's a nice change that just gives communities a little more flexibility with how they administer the funds now. We're going to move into some of the key program features that we want to make sure you keep in mind as you're working on your rental housing project proposals and as you begin to complete the application materials, which were released on October 31st and are now out and up on our website. In terms of some of the key features, these are just really important things for you to keep in mind as you're putting your application together and just your project plan together. The first really relates to the fact that there is a maximum award amount under the program, and that's 25% of the total development cost of the project. Applicants will submit a project workbook that demonstrates, that's one of our application tools, that funds would not exceed the statutory threshold. This is an application threshold requirement, and Minnesota Housing will not review applications that request grant funds in excess of 25% of the total development cost. So this is just sort of a baseline. Make sure you're not requesting more than you're eligible for under the statute that is that the program has to be administered under. But the other thing I want you to keep in mind in thinking about this 25% of the TDC total amount is, in order for your particular project to be competitive, we'll also be evaluating leverage and readiness of the project to proceed and several other factors, which I'll talk about in the presentation here today as well. So you want to be thinking of both. One, not requesting more than you're eligible for, but also right-sizing your request to maximize leverage in the project to help ensure that these resources can stretch as far as they possibly can to serve needs throughout Minnesota communities around the state. With respect to the construction timeline, construction must begin within 12 months of signing the grant contract. And then the expectation is that construction completion must occur within 24 months of construction start. And some of that speaks to, I think, the component I talked about before too with our selection criteria around readiness to proceed, and that we'll be evaluating that as part of our selection criteria when proposals are received here at Minnesota Housing. Other key features include a matching funds requirement. So applicants must have a commitment of matching funds for $1 for every $2 of grant funds or deferred loan funds requested through the Workforce Housing Development Program. Applicants will submit a government resolution that states where the matching funds will come from. So for example, matching funds are eligible to come from a local unit of government, a business or employer in the community, a nonprofit, or any combination thereof. So keep in mind as you're trying to secure your matching funds requirement under the program that you could be securing matching funds to meet the matching funds requirement from all three potential types of eligible sources. So that gives you some flexibility within your community to really create an effort and a collaborative kind of plan to help support the need for rental housing in your community if you're making a request in for the Workforce Housing Development Program. Matching funds do not have to be a cash investment in the project. They can also be comprised of in-kind donations or, again, any combination thereof. It is important to note, however, if you are securing in-kind donations and you would like that to count toward your matching funds requirement, you do have to have documentation of the valuation of those in-kind donations so that that can be reviewed per the statutory requirements of the program. It's also important to note that matching funds cannot come from the developer owner, any entity affiliated with the developer owner, or previously incurred project costs. None of those things would count toward the matching funds requirement and test under the program. We're going to move in this next section into a discussion of how applications will be selected and scored by our selection committee at Minnesota Housing. So applicants must demonstrate that they meet several threshold requirements. They must demonstrate that they are in an eligible project area, and these are all really largely driven by the statute that governs the program. They must also demonstrate that the vacancy rate in the area is at or below 5% for the previous 2 years. And they must demonstrate that the funds will be used for statutory qualified expenditures and that they will have the required commitment of matching funds, and they must demonstrate community need for the proposed project. I'm going to cover each of these requirements on the next few slides to make sure you've got a good understanding of the statutory requirements related to each of these. So the first one we're going to look at a little more closely is what constitutes an eligible project area. Minnesota Housing has also posted a map and city list on our website that outlines all of the cities in Minnesota that meet the population preference of 30,000 or fewer residents. Now, again, it's important to note that that's a preference. So that doesn't mean that if you're in a community with just over 30,000 that you're ineligible to apply. You can certainly still apply, but note that there is a statutory requirement and a preference built into this program for serving populations and communities with 30,000 or fewer residents. In most cases, small and medium-sized cities can refer to the map and eligible city list on our website to determine if you are eligible. And eligibility is defined in the statute and includes a home rule charter or statutory city located outside of the metro area with a population exceeding 500, a community that has a combined population of 1,500 residents located within 15 miles of a home rule charter or statutory city located outside the metro area, and then any area served by a joint county-city economic development authority. If the project area is listed on our eligible home rule charter statutory city list, you clearly meet the requirement and can kind of move on to the next set of program requirements as you are preparing your application. However, if you do not find your community listed on our eligible home rule charter statutory city list, that does not necessarily mean you are ineligible. In that case, you want to make sure that you either provide a map of the project area and evidence that the community has a combined population of 1,500 residents located within 15 miles of the home rule charter or statutory city, or provide documentation of the project area and the joint county-city economic development authority. So we just want to be really clear. We've created kind of a map of communities that are clearly eligible, but if you don't find yourselves listed on that map, you may be able to meet this eligibility requirement in one of two possible ways. So make sure you explore whether or not you meet those two other criteria, and certainly Katie is available if you have additional questions about that. So make sure you reach out to us so that we can help make that determination if you have any questions. Okay, the second requirement from a threshold standpoint that we want to drill down on a little bit relates to the vacancy rate. So to demonstrate that you meet the vacancy rate requirements, you will submit a signed certification form stating that the average vacancy rate has been at or below 5% for a minimum of 2 years. We will not be asking for market studies to support this, though certainly if your community has initiated a market study or is interested in doing that, that can be a best practice in terms of really understanding what the market need is in your community for what types of housing. So, but in terms of meeting our application requirements, we are not actually requiring a market study, but to the extent that you've already undertaken that effort or are interested in undertaking that effort to, again, really understand the market demand for different types of housing in your community, we certainly wouldn't discourage that. But we do have a signed certification form that you can use to verify that your vacancy rate meets the statutory requirements of the program. I want to just swing back briefly before I leave the vacancy rate and the matching funds requirement to answer a question that had come in related to, can matching funds come from tax increments? So yes, that is an eligible source of meeting the matching funds. Okay, the next threshold requirement relates to qualified expenditures. And so to meet the qualified expenditure threshold requirement, you will also certify at the time of application that if you are awarded funds, they will result in the direct development of market rate residential rental properties. And so that's essentially what is required by the statute, that how these grant funds are awarded to you, and then how you in turn award the funds, whether that's in the form of a grant or a deferred loan, to a project, has to result in the direct development of market rate residential rental units. So that's essentially, you want to make sure as you're applying for our funding that that end result will be realized and actual, and that will be part of your responsibility as an eventual grantee of Minnesota Housing. Moving back to the matching funds piece, as we discussed, applicants must have a commitment of matching funds for $1 for every $2 requested. You will have to submit a government resolution that states where the matching funds will come from. So, for example, if a portion is coming from government, a portion from business or an employer, and a portion from a nonprofit, that would be outlined in that resolution. And we've got a template on our website that we've developed for your use. Katie will walk you through that because we want to help facilitate making the application materials as clear as possible. So we've tried to develop some templates that will hopefully be useful to you as you consider applying under the program. Matching funds do not have to be, again, a cash investment in the project. They could be in-kind donations, but if they are, we want to make sure that you have that valuation clearly documented so that we can, again, do the math test that's required to ensure that you're meeting that matching fund requirement. And then just a reminder that they cannot come from the developer owner or an entity affiliated with the developer owner, and that if you have previously incurred project costs, those would not count toward the match. The next threshold requirement that we want to drill down on a little bit relates to community need. And here, applicants have to provide a written statement from at least one or more businesses that employ a minimum of 20 full-time equivalent employees. The business or businesses must be located in the eligible project area or within 25 miles of the area. That letter must indicate the lack of available rental housing and how it has impeded their ability to recruit and hire employees, the number of FTEs, and the distance from the eligible project area. And again, here we've created a template for you to use as well, just to help ensure that these three things are addressed in that letter from the employer to make sure that we're meeting the statutory requirements of the program. So applicants who meet these threshold requirements that I've just gone over will be scored according to the final 5 criteria. Those include readiness to proceed, which will comprise 25% of the total score. Examples of things that we'll be looking at there include site control, zoning and approvals, and secured financing. Leverage will comprise 25% of the total score. Market rate units as comprised of the share of all units will comprise 10% of the total score. Community size, again, ensuring that we're meeting that statutory preference for serving communities of 30,000 or fewer in population, will comprise 10% of the total score. And feasibility, community need will comprise 30% of the total score. When we're looking at things like leverage, we're going to be looking at the applicant's funding request as a percentage of the total development cost. When we're looking at feasibility, we're going to be looking at things like capacity of the development team and evidence that there is a need for workforce housing in the area, including a community that demonstrates job growth or will demonstrate job growth, the current rental housing supply in the area, and if the proposal includes a mix of market rate and affordable units, and then how those align with the needs of the current workforce. In terms of your grantee responsibilities, it's always kind of fun to move to this stage where you're thinking about you've done all the work with your project team to kind of develop that proposal. You've got your development team selected. You've applied to Minnesota Housing, and now you've been awarded funds. So assuming everyone's in that category at some point in time or another, I know we've only got $2 million available this round, but over time, everyone gets here at some point in time who's got a community need. You would become a Minnesota Housing grantee. There are a few grantee responsibilities we want to make sure you're aware of as you complete your application. The first relates to monitoring. So if you're awarded funds, we want to make sure that you have a good sense of the tools that will be needed to meet the monitoring and reporting requirements under this program. Because these are grant funds, Minnesota Housing follows the Office of Grants Management policies and procedures. And the Office of Grants Management is housed within state government under the Minnesota Management and Budget Division of State Government. The big responsibilities really relate to annual reporting. Grantees will report on the progress of the project during the prior year, including how far along the construction is, and if complete, where they are at with respect to leasing up the property. Financial monitoring will also occur prior to the final disbursement of funds. Most likely, we are still sort of formulating all of our monitoring and reporting framework and tools under the program, so that's still in process and under development, given that we just really received this program as of July 1st. But most likely, we anticipate that financial monitoring will be in the form of budget reconciliation of the previous draw. So we are looking to create monitoring and reporting tools that are right-sized to this program and your project, but that provide kind of that assurance that's needed with programs that use state dollars and resources to make sure that they were used for the intent of the program. So we are looking to try and right-size our monitoring and reporting responsibilities, but we want you to be aware and anticipate that there will be certain responsibilities you will have under these funds. So now thinking ahead in terms of what's the application timeline. I know many of you are familiar with the Workforce Housing Development Program previously. You've maybe worked with DEED or are familiar with kind of how the program operated when it was housed at DEED. And so I want to just give you the assurance that we've been working as hard as we can to try and get the program up and operational so that you could understand our application materials and timelines associated with them. I know our timeline is a little bit behind deeds, but in terms of just having the program come over to us, we've been working pretty hard to try and get it up and running as quickly as we can while defining some of the parameters of the program. So applications will be due by 6:30 p.m. Central Standard Time on January 25th, 2018. Applicants will submit their completed applications to a secure upload tool. The link to the upload tool is listed in the application and can also be found on our website. We'll show you where and how to access the upload tool later in this demonstration. Applications will then be reviewed and scored internally and presented to a selection committee in February. We expect to take recommendations to our Board of Directors meeting in March, and that's typically the fourth Thursday in March, so it's at the tail end of the March month. Awards would then be announced kind of directly after that Minnesota Housing Board meeting and then posted on our website. Katie will go through a demonstration of how to actually access all the application materials, which I think will be really, really worthwhile for those of you trying to familiarize yourselves with what will be required with Minnesota Housing's application of the fund.
Thank you, Devin. My name is Katie Moore, and I am the program manager here at Minnesota Housing for the Workforce Housing Program. And I'm going to take some time here to walk you through our website and the application materials. So you can reach our website at www.mnhousing.gov. So from our main page on our website, you would just click on the multifamily rental partners box over on the right-hand side, and then you will find the link to the Workforce Housing Program right on the multifamily main page. So once you get to our Workforce Housing Program page, this is where you'll find all the resources that you need. We have information about who can apply, who the eligible recipients are, and then our application materials. So when you start looking at the application materials, you probably want to start with the application checklist first. I'm just going to open that up here. And so here is our application checklist. It's a list of all the items that you're going to need for a complete application when you're submitting to us. And then we also have a brief description of each item and more information to help you when you're trying to provide supporting documentation. And then if any of these items require additional, like the affirmative action form, you can click on that and it'll link directly to the item, and you can open it up from there. So I would recommend starting with the application checklist first so you can get an overview of all of the items that you're going to need when you're completing your application materials. The next item is the application and narrative, and so this is where you're going to have the bulk of the information that we'll be looking over when we're reviewing applications. When you open this up, you'll first see a lot of information about the background of the program, information about the RFP and timeline, as well as a high-level overview of the requirements if you're awarded funds. You'll also find information about the threshold and scoring criteria and things like that. And right here, you'll find the information for submitting the applications, which I will come back to later in the presentation and walk you through a demonstration of that. So the actual narrative questions begin on page 4 of this document. And so you want to make sure as you're going through that you're answering each of these completely and as concise as possible. We're really just making sure that we have quality information over quantity information so that when we're reviewing applications, we have good things that we can base our scoring off of. I want to highlight a few of the questions on the checklist on the application for you to pay attention to. The first one, question number 3, we're asking for a project description and information about the population. Make sure that you provide supporting documentation that supports your population estimates, because we will be looking at that, because as Devin talked about, there is a statutory preference for a population of 30,000 or fewer residents. Another question to pay attention to is question number 5. If your project will include units with rent restrictions, make sure to provide information about what those restrictions are, how many units will be restricted, and the reasoning. For example, maybe one of your funding sources requires a minimum of 2 restricted units. Just explain that in this section here so that we know. The next section in the application is about market information. Use this section to write narratives supporting the letters or the letters of support that you have from the local businesses. Talk about job growth and things like that in the area. And in the next section, for capacity of the development and management team, we're looking for specific experience examples of your development team for multifamily housing development. And so this will be looked at when we're reviewing for feasibility. And finally, the last section is asking about general information about the project, including what public infrastructure is already on site, what the status of approvals are for the project, and when you expect construction to begin. Remember, construction must start within 12 months of the grant contract execution and must be complete within 24 months of the construction start date. And I want to highlight the last 2 questions in this section as well. In question 18, we'll be checking to make sure that all of the sources in your workbook match the sources in this section. We'll be looking for evidence that sources of funds are secured. Not all of the sources of funds need to be secured, but you will have a competitive advantage for those that are secured. And you also need to support, if you are counting them as secured, you need to provide supporting documentation for that. We'll only count funds as secured if you do provide the appropriate supporting documentation. For example, a letter from the bank would count as supporting documentation for your first mortgage. Question 19 is asking for specific information about the match. The workbook does have a line item on the sources tab for matching funds. In this question, we're looking for a description of where the match is coming from. For example, if part of the match is coming from a tax abatement, part of the match is coming from a land donation, and the remainder is coming from a cash donation from a local nonprofit, we're looking for that information to be explained in this section. The match amounts on the local government resolution should be consistent with what is listed here and in the workbook. So there's kind of a few different places that we will be asking for this amount, and just make sure that you're consistent as you're filling out your materials. The next application item I want to go over is the certification form. A signed copy of this has to be submitted with your application materials. And when signing this, you're certifying that your project is an eligible project according to statutes, that the vacancy rate meets the statutory requirements, and that the funds will be used for qualified expenditures. You're also certifying that you'll mitigate any environmental issues appropriately, that you will comply with your local building code or the state building code if your area does not have a local code. And you're also certifying that grant funds will not exceed 25% of the total development costs, that your project is an eligible property, and that matching funds are not coming from the developer or an entity related to the developer. So make sure you keep that in mind and pay close attention to what you're actually certifying to when you're filling out this form. And so the next item is the workbook. And I'm going to take a little bit more time looking over this workbook versus the other application materials, because this is where the bulk of the information will come from. When you open up the workbook, so those of you who have worked with Minnesota housing before, this workbook is a very condensed version of what we would normally ask developers to fill out for the consolidated RFP. So some of you that have worked with us before might be kind of familiar, but this is a much simpler version of the workbook. So when you first open it, you'll open up to the instruction page, and basically any of the cells in the workbook that are blue are fillable cells, and all of the white cells are either information that we have listed or calculations, so we've locked those for editing. The next tab is the summary tab. You don't need to worry about any information here. This is going to auto-populate based on what you enter in the rest of the workbook. The next tab is the project description tab. You'll enter general information about the project and the development team on this tab. I want to just walk over this activity type here. Mark an X indicating which activity your project falls under. For example, if your project is the conversion of an old schoolhouse to apartments, you would just mark an X next to the conversion / adapted reuse option here. So that's basically what you'll enter in under that tab. The next tab is the unit mix tab. Here you'll enter information about the units, including the number of bedrooms and how many of these unit types will exist in the property. You'll also enter in gross rents. Make sure you're entering this information correctly, as it will carry through to the cash flow tab. And we will also be looking at the property's cash flow when we're reviewing for feasibility. Pay attention to these last two columns right here, the number of market rate units and the number of rent and income restricted units. We're asking here for you to tell us how many of each unit type will be market rates and how many will have rent and income restrictions. So for example, say you have 10 one-bedroom, one-bath units, and 2 of them will have rent and income restrictions. If the gross rent for those units will be the same, you can keep them on one line and just mark 8 as market rate units and 2 as rent and income restricted units. You could also break these out on 2 different lines. So say, for example, the market rate units will rent for $800 and the rent restricted units will rent for $750. You could break those out here on 2 different lines as well. Just make sure that for each line item of bedrooms, baths, and number of units, that you're telling us how many of each units will be market rate versus rent and income restricted. And you can always contact me if you have questions while you're filling out the workbook. So don't worry if you have questions as you're looking over that in the future. The next tab is the operating budget. Here you'll just enter general information about the operating expenses for the property. Keep in mind that all of this information that you're entering here will also flow through to the cash flow calculation tab. And we're hoping for those of you that applied with DEED in the past for this program, their budget was really on a Word document. It was a fillable table. So we're hoping that with our workbook here, since it's an Excel spreadsheet, a lot of these calculations are pulling through and auto-populating for you. So hopefully that will make the process a little bit easier as you're applying. The next tab is the mortgage calculation tab. Here's where you will enter the information for your first mortgage, as well as if you have a TIF mortgage, you'll enter that into this tab as well. And this information, again, pulls through to your cash flow. The next tab is the development costs. And here's where you'll enter costs from your development for your project, including the cost of the land, construction costs, any professional fees, the developer fee, financing costs, and things like that. And here is where when we're reviewing, we'll be looking to double check and make sure that these costs and the funds that you're requesting do not exceed 25% of the total cost listed on this tab. The next tab in the workbook is the sources tab. Here you'll enter the interim and permanent sources of funding for your project. There's also extra lines right here if you have additional items that we haven't built into the workbook for you. There's also room for comments and details to the right of each of those sources. And the numbers listed here in your workbook should be consistent with questions 18 and 19 in your application narrative that we discussed earlier, asking about a description of your sources as well as the match in the funds that you're requesting from us. Note that line 20 here is the line item for the match commitment, and then 21 is the line item for the funds that you are requesting. And when you enter that, it's going to pull through to other places in the workbook as well. And just make sure that those numbers are consistent with your other application materials. And the last tab that you'll actually be entering information into is the cash flow tab. A lot of the fields are already going to be pulling from other places in the workbook, like I already said, but you'll also need to enter things like the rent inflator, the vacancy rate inflator, and things like that to complete your cash flow. When reviewing applications, we will be making sure that your cash flows are complete and that they make sense based on the market information that you're providing in the narrative questions. And then the final tab in the workbook is the amortization schedule for your first mortgage. And you don't need to fill anything out on this tab. This will auto-populate based on the information that you enter in the mortgage calculation tab. So that is the bulk of the workbook right there. And if you have any questions, again, as you're filling this out and completing applications, you can always reach out to me and I can help you walk you through some of those questions that you have. Some of the other documents under the application materials include the affirmative action statement that you'll have to fill out and submit, the equal employment opportunity policy statement. As Devin talked about, we also have a template for the letter of employee support, and I'll just open that up here so that you can see what that looks like. So you would just want to transfer that, the employer would want to transfer this over to their letterhead and fill this out, and we've added information. Make sure the name of the company, the development name is listed, as well as the number of full-time employees and the distance from the project that you're proposing. And again, if you need more than one employer to satisfy the minimum of the 20 full-time employee requirements, you can submit more than one letter of support to us. And the other item that we have is the local government resolution. And so we have a template here for you. And then obviously your legal team would just want to edit and modify this as necessary. If you have, for example, if the match is coming from more than one funding source, you'd obviously need to break that out a little bit more than what we have here in just this basic format. And then also, if you go back to this application checklist, all of those forms that I just walked through are linked to here as well. So really, you could just open this checklist form and work from here and then just check off each item as you finish it. So you can find, all of the application materials either here or on our website itself. Other resources I want to point out to you on our website, our program guide is here. I would recommend taking a look at that and make sure that you understand the program requirements. We also have an FAQ that we updated since the first e-news that we sent out based on some of the questions that we've been getting from everyone. We also have the eligibility list for eligible cities. We have a map as well as an actual list for the cities that meet the population preference. And again, as Devin talked about, if you aren't on this list, you just need to provide additional supporting documentation stating how you are an eligible project area. You can also sign up for the e-news right here. And then lastly, and it looks like we're getting close to the end here, I wanted to go over how you will submit applications to us. And I just am looking here for the application document. Okay, so if you go back to the application and narrative questions, on page 2 that has the application instructions, you're going to click on this link. It's the multifamily secure upload tool, and you're going to submit materials to this email address right here, the mhfa.app.state.mn.us. And I'm just going to show you, if you click on that link, what that looks like, just to make it a little bit easier here, if I can get the link to work. So this is our secure login page. You're going to go down to the multifamily secure upload tool and click on that link. And it's going to take you to the upload page. You're going to click on secure upload. And here's where you're going to enter that email address, the mhfa.app. And then when you click start, that will take you into where you'll actually start uploading the document. So I just wanted to walk you through that so that it makes sense to you. If you're having any technical issues while you're working on submitting your application, you can email that email address directly, and that will get you some technical support as needed. But that is how you'll upload the applications. So I just want to pause again here real fast and take a look at our questions to see if we have any other questions, and then we will finish up the presentation. So one moment here.
Evan and Katie, we're going to tag team on the questions that have come back in. So going back, we had another question about prevailing wage. And again, I just want to reiterate our guide reinforces that with respect to the prevailing wage issue, we defer back to you to work with your legal team to see if prevailing wage would apply within the context of the project as you're designing it and how you intend to use the funds and how you intend to allocate the funds. So, it is possible it would apply, but again, we're deferring back to you to work with your legal team to see what the statutory requirements are around prevailing wage and how those would be impacted depending on how your project is structured and how the awards are intended to be used. We have another question about mixed use, and that's one I'm going to take offline. We'll have to update that as part of our FAQs. So all of our conversations internally have really centered around mixed income development, not mixed use. So that's one. Before I give any premature guidance, let me take that back. We'll add that to our legal counsel consult list and try and provide some better guidance with respect to that. If awarded, how are the grant funds dispersed? Are they awarded in a lump sum or on a reimbursement basis? Katie, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think our grant award process envisions up to a third being awarded on the front end of the project.
Correct, yep.
And then can you explain the other disbursement checks from there?
So then there would be two more disbursements. So you would get up to a third of your funds at a time. The final disbursement we would hold until we do the final monitoring and the financial monitoring and review of your project. So that would be at the very end of your construction period.
Oh, someone said the volume's not working, so hopefully you can hear us. Sorry. Then we had some feedback on an item in our workbook, so duly noted. We'll take that feedback back internally. Will the slides or a recording of the webinar be made available? Yes, we do intend to make this available. Should be available, Patty, later this week. Oh, tomorrow? See, there you go. She's even better than I say later this week to give us flexibility, but Patty's that good. It should be up tomorrow. And then in terms of the workforce guide, that is the guide on the website. And so the guide is the same as the program guide. We use that term sort of interchangeably. So sorry for the confusion there. Does the TIF fund match need to be for only eligible expenses, or can it be a cash match for this grant? I guess I'm not sure if I'm understanding that question correctly. Can you, Barbara, let's maybe take that offline because I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're asking before I answer that prematurely. So in terms of, we are not, I think maybe what I'm understanding from this is we are not necessarily mirroring up how the matching funds are used with eligibility under this grant. So although eligibility under the grant is pretty wide open. So Barbara, let's take kind of some of your questions offline so that we can make sure that we're on the same page. We can reach back out to you directly and make sure we're understanding some of your questions. Okay, with that, we're 3 minutes over time, but not bad for our first go round. We are going to be out in a couple of different greater Minnesota housing communities this week and next. So we're in Windham on Wednesday of this week and Baxter on Monday. So if anyone is up in those areas or down in that part of the state and wants to come visit and hear more about us again, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, the slides will be available. We'll be looking to update the FAQs with some additional new great questions that came out of this webinar. No doubt we might get a couple questions over the course of the next couple weeks as we're out and about in communities as well. Please make sure you get added to the e-news distribution list and then reach out to us with questions. We're really committed. It's our first time launching a new program. There's always things you don't envision. You know, if something doesn't work in the application or in the workbook as you're submitting items, you know, just reach out to us early. We want to be a partner in making sure the application materials are easily accessible, streamlined, and understandable. With that, thank you all for your commitment to workforce housing needs in your communities, and we look forward to working together with you now and in the future. Have a great day.